Begin chapter. Sheila scheduled the time for a physical. Sheila's blood pressure was historically low, so her having a blood pressure of 120/80 means something has changed. Since Sheila has neurofibromatosis, her doctor Brian Sims suggested that she also have a sonogram of her abdominal area. She took the time to do so. Brian called 2 days before her scheduled knee surgery. "You can't have the surgery," he insisted. Providence. I truly learned the meaning of providence when I was in college. It wasn't a word in my dictionary until then. I had a United States history teacher who talked about this country's founding fathers. He used the word providence on many occasions while talking about Paul Revere, Thomas Paine, or any of the other individuals who gave up so much so that we could have a republic form of government. I was truly impressed with his riveting lessons. In retrospect, it is so strange that I never recall that word being used as I grew up. Sheila had thought it to be uncanny that I had such a sheltered childhood that I did not know of the word. Uncanny or not, I knew what a brockle-faced cow looked like, and I knew the difference between cattywampus and kitty corner. I really didn't think the city girl, Sheila, knew the difference between cattywampus and kitty corner. Nor do I think she ever used either word. Our words are a product of our geographical upbringing. I recall in 2nd grade going home to ask my parents what a taxi was, and it was on a standardized test, and that I had never heard the word. I am sure Sheila, on the other hand, had most likely ridden in a taxi long before she was in 2nd grade. We are sometimes limited by the words we don't know and liberated by the words we do know. Learning the word providence was a liberating experience, as it explained so much. However, I don't remember one sermon in my childhood with the word providence in it. Interestingly, the few sermons that I have preached, I probably used the word providence at least once in every 3rd sermon. In my church group, I preach about every 4th or 5th Sunday evening, so that members hear this word more in just a year's time than I heard into my first 20 years of life. Providence is such a cool word. It is the protective nature of God. We have free will, but a loving God protects us, guides us, and gives us the knowledge that life has meaning. It makes so much sense that a college professor would use this word when explaining the founding fathers, because even though many were not associated with a specific church group, they knew how to put their faith in the divine, God. Studying the amazing development of our republic and the brilliant individuals who built it, only the staunchest atheist would believe something other than the providence was at work. Although the word providence is used only one time in the Bible, it is a powerful word. Divine providence, or direction, shows that God is still active in our lives and in our progress through life. He hasn't just taken a backseat and watched as our lives unfold, as some individuals seem to believe. I am by no means a charismatic, or what some call a full gospel Christian. I believe that the First Testament gifts of the Holy Spirit were necessary for the church to grow, especially through the times of persecution. But I also believe that by the date 70 AD, the gifts of speaking in tongues, fantastic miracles, and prophecies were gone. Just to be clear, I do believe that there is power in prayer. I also believe in providence. The fact that God watches out for us and provides for our safety if we have faith was evidenced in a very unusual trip that Sheila and I took when Sarah and Gina were tiny children. God was truly watching out for us. She was about 6 months pregnant with Dana. We had purchased a 20-year-old motorhome for less than $3,000. It was a 26-foot-long A-class motorhome with a beautiful 440 cubic inch engine. It was pretty much the same engine that was found in many of the sleek and powerful muscle cars of the 70s. Like the fast, sleek, and beautiful muscle cars, the 440 was a beautiful engine usually associated with speed, not usually associated with moving a big boxy motorhome down a winding highway. The muscle cars and the motorhome shared one thing in common: their 4-barrel carburetor could guzzle a bunch of fuel. I had remodeled the inside of this 20-year-old motorhome with the help of Sheila. Gina was too small to help, but she liked to watch the progress. We would lower the table in the kitchen to the height of the seats, cover it in pillows and stuffed animals, and it became a playpen for the excited toddler. Gina was perfectly content to watch as we drilled, hammered, and sweated. Sheila made curtains and seat covers. Sarah and I replaced the water system and made a slide-out sofa and reupholstered the seats at the kitchen table. We changed oil, checked to make certain that the toilet flushed properly and that the shower heater and refrigerator and the air condition worked. We were ready for a maiden voyage. I dug out my 8-tracks from storage. Yes, the motorhome had an 8-track player. And the weirder thing is, I still had kept some tapes from the 70s. I was into country music as well as rock music at the time, so I had a variety of CDs from the country music genre. My rock 8-tracks most likely didn't survive the overplaying of them in college. I would have loved to have some rock band or pop singer tapes from the 70s or even the 80s for the mobile home, but I couldn't find any, even at used bookstores in San Antonio. The 8-track had already become a thing of the past, not found anywhere except an occasional yard sale from time to time. Our plan was to go to Wyoming to visit friends and family. We designed a route to travel to the Texas Panhandle, and then explore the northeastern corner of New Mexico to Raton. Then we would travel Raton, over the mountain to Trinidad, Colorado, and then up I-25 to Wyoming. I purchased some magnetic towing lights to attach to the hood of our pickup, and bought a tow bar to connect the two vehicles. I hitched up my small pickup to the back of the RV and plugged in the pig lights for the light. And we started out. The first part of the trip went well. We found a free trailer park in La Mesa. We connected our motorhome to the hookups and expected to have a restful evening. As it turned out, the water pressure at the trailer park was much higher than the pressure at which I tested these lines at home. A water line burst under the bathroom sink. As luck would have it, there was a small box of plumbing parts, washers, and nuts and bolts that the previous owner had left with the motorhome tucked away in a cabinet under the kitchen table. When remodeling, as we were cleaning things out, I made a mental note that the box had things that might come in handy, so the box stayed with our tools in the cabinet. Everything we needed to fix the line was in that box. It took, at most, a half hour to fix the pipes and turn the water back on again. We enjoyed the rest of the evening. The weather was great, the children got to play in the grass, and the sunset was beautiful. We got an early start the next morning, and after coffee and a hot breakfast, we headed northward toward the Panhandle. Through Lubbock and Amarillo, everything worked like a dream. The children were playing in their seats, Sheila was acting as a navigator, and I was enjoying being high as I drove, able to see over the top of just about everything on the road. I became uneasily traveling between Dumas and Dalhart. I was originally planning to turn at Dalhart to travel towards Clayton and Raton. Something in my head was nearly screaming at me to travel through Oklahoma and not New Mexico. Sheila and I had learned a long time ago to follow that something that wants to redirect us from time to time. Neither of us wanted to change our plans. The sightseeing in Oklahoma and Kansas is not as nearly as spectacular as the sightseeing while traveling from Raton over the mountain pass into Colorado. Although Oklahoma and Kansas both have their own rare beauties, the roads were not as good, and we would miss many of the mountains. After a quick rest stop in Dalton to fuel up, I got in the driver's seat and asked Sheila for a map. What should we do? Should we proceed as our plan, or were we going to talk ourselves into traveling up the roads that were less familiar? We opted for the latter. Rather than turning west, we turned northeast on US 412 to travel through Oklahoma and into Kansas, following what some would call our intuition. We stopped at Liberal, Kansas to see the sights and the local attractions. Gina was likely too young to remember Liberal, Kansas, but Sheila, Sarah, and I thought that visiting this little town and its local attractions was worth the respite from the bumpy roads through Oklahoma and all of the feedlots of the two panhandles. We spent about an hour taking pictures and then grabbed some food and headed north. We got to Nebraska, and I noticed we were having problems stopping. In fact, we had essentially no brakes at all. This was very obviously determined by a harrowing experience of rolling through a four-way stop without slowing. Thankfully, there was no traffic for miles. My inhibitions about taking this route had dissolved away, and I was so grateful that we went this route. For starters, traffic was almost non-existent, so no one was around to see me running through a four-way stop. The second reason was that everything was pretty flat in Kansas. I could see for miles and was able to flow to allow friction and the poor little emergency brake to bring me to a stop if I needed. I was ever reminded of the presence of the pickup attached to the back of the providing even more momentum to this 26-foot motorhome. There was such things as cell phones at the time. We didn't have one, and this was during the mid-90s, so even if we did have one, we wouldn't have reception in the middle of Kansas. There was no one to call, no GPS to find a mechanic, and to make things more interesting, it was a Sunday. Being a Sunday helped with traffic, but it didn't help with trying to find a repair shop open to work on the motorhome. We limped along the road at the modest pace and made it to Kansas-Nebraska state line. We did find a small RV park next to a lake in Nebraska with a fairly level pad. I parked, shut off the engine, and immediately set blocks against the tires. Yes, I had the emergency brake set, but after using it for the past hour, I was unsure of how useful it would continue to be. I even set the brake in our pickups that we were towing and put it in gear to keep us stable. To this day, I am ever so grateful that we did not go across the mountain. I would not have been happy trying to use a runaway truck ramp with my wife and children on board halfway from the summit to Trinidad. The thought of having no brakes on a mountain sent chills down my back. That morning, Sheila and I had a decision to make. What do we do? Should I unhitch the pickup and drive to Wyoming and leave the RV behind? Should I put Sheila and the kids in the pickup and have them follow me? Sheila is terrible at driving stick shift, and I know she didn't want to drive the pickup for any distance on unfamiliar roads. Putting the 5 of us in a tiny pickup seemed dangerous. Dana wasn't born yet, but she still takes up room. If the pickup was a cab crew or even a cab with a fold-down jumper seat, I probably would have just done that. I brought the pickup for events such as this, but using it didn't seem like a good option at the time. So, I chose what was likely the most dangerous option. Yes, indeed, I am known for some lame decisions, but this one was probably one of the lamest. I chose to limp along with the pickup in tow and continue our trip without brakes. The next morning, we enjoyed a good breakfast, said a prayer, and headed for Wyoming. My parents lived in Torrington, Wyoming at the time, and we headed directly for their house. As Grace would have it, made it without incident. Traveling through Scottsbluff was a bit harrowing, but the stoplights were good to us. I never had a need to stop. I might have caught a yellow one, but the rest were gloriously green. We got to my parents' house. They had a cement pad to the east of their house, probably used by the previous owner for parking an RV. We took advantage of the pad, and the parking was level, and we were relieved. We had actually made the trip through 2 states without brakes, without incident, in a 26-foot-long motorhome while pulling a pickup. It was a bad decision, and of course I was extra careful, but if I were to do it all over again, I would have done something more safety cautious. A childhood and lifelong friend of mine had opened a mechanic shop in the same town. He and his brother grew up across the road from me on Orchid Bench, just a mile or so from our farmhouse of Basin. Both of our fathers were farmers, and the boys and I worked many long hours on our parents' farms, but we also rather enjoyed a bit of mischief. He and I both had motorcycles. We would use them to go irrigating, and later, when the work was done, we would abuse them in the hills. We had similar tastes, each had similar pickups, and later we both became owners of the greatest four-wheel drive vehicle of the 70s, an International Scout, a vehicle we each referred to as a binder. For the history of Bluff, a binder was an essential piece of farm equipment more than 100 years ago. For those of you who don't know, ownership of a binder produces a sort of brotherhood. Those looking from the outside in probably cannot figure out what was so wonderful about owning one of these vehicles. I can assure you, those of us who have owned one would give a lot to own one again. This vehicle hasn't been produced since 1980, and in my opinion was the best four-wheel drive vehicle ever to grace this planet. My friend to this day still owns one. I am very grateful for my friend having a mechanic shop in Torrington, and more grateful that he found a way to fit me into his busy schedule. Somewhat as expected, the master cylinder for the brakes was no good, and I had lost a lot of my brake fluid. My friend ordered another master cylinder out of Cheyenne, and I would be delivered by the mail next day. I believe that he felt sorry for me because he only charged me for parts and maybe a smidgen of labor, but within 2 days he had me fixed and ready for the road again. We had a nice time visiting friends and family, but by the 3rd day we wanted to travel elsewhere. We left the pickup at my parents' house, loaded the kids into the motorhome, and headed for Laramie. We spent the day there, ate at my favorite Mexican restaurant in West Laramie, stomped around the university a bit, and then we headed back to Torrington. This is where our trip gets even stranger. We chalked up the events to the first part of the trip to intuition and luck, but after a while, more than luck comes into play. I told Sheila that no one is going to believe that this actually happened, but the events did indeed occur. We backed into the parking lot of my father's garage and shut off the engine. I heard a clunk. The noise came from under the motorhome. I looked under the vehicle, and there was a starter laying on the ground along with 2 bolts that held it in place. Grabbing a wrench, I crawled under the bumper and positioned myself below the motor to see what damage had been done. Nothing. The wires were just long enough that they were still connected to the starter, and the threads on the bolts had not been stripped. I aligned the drive pinion gear to the openings in the flywheel, hand-screwed the bolts to hold the starter in place, and tightened it all with a crescent wrench. I crawled out from under the vehicle, got in, turned the switch on, and the motor started right off. It was amazing because I knew that any time during that 180-mile road trip that day, the starter could have fallen off, and I wouldn't have known unless I had run it over. For the bolts to hold until we parked the vehicle was nothing short of divine intervention. For the wires to be long enough for the starter to reach the ground without stretching or tearing, and for the bolts to not have stripped the threads as well, was simply amazing. We finished our visit and traveled to Basin to see some friends that we hadn't seen in a few years. Jennifer and Fred took a couple days off to spend some time with us. We loaded up and traveled to Show, Wyoming to camp out, do some fishing, and enjoy our time. That evening, as we were getting the girls ready for bed, we made ready the bunks that our guests were going to use. Fred and Jennifer got a pull-out bunk directly above the passenger and driver's seat. Previously, as we were making the motorhome ready, I often put the kids in the top bunk. They liked it and could easily see out the side windows. They would have had some of their favorite toys, blankets stored away in the wall pockets that were only accessible when the bunk was pulled down and positioned for use. The next morning, they rolled out of the bunk, and we all sat around the table eating breakfast just in time to see and hear the weirdest things have happened. The 120-pound bunk broke loose and fell over the front seats and the dash. No one was near it, but we all saw it, and we were silent for a short moment. Uncanny was the word. It provided support for 2 of them all night long. It provided support for my children who would play on it when I was working to make the motorhome ready for this voyage. It could have fallen on Sheila and me at any time during our 1,600-mile adventure. We were lucky. It took Fred and me and all the strength we could muster to lift it into place and replace the bolts that had sheared from the frame. Where do we find the replacement bolts, you might ask? Well, you see, was this little box of plumbing parts, washers, nuts, and bolts. Yes, indeed, that previous owner left exactly what we needed to fix the bunk. The bolts were about 1 inch longer than the ones that were initially holding up the bunk, but otherwise, they were the same type and the size as the sheared bolts. Our trip was getting a bit bizarre. We finished our time in Shell and headed back to Basin. We dropped Fred and Jennifer off at their place, said our goodbyes, and headed home. I was not going to go across any mountains with this rig. I was not going to adventure down I-25, as busy as it always is. I simply decided to take the back roads home and stop to check tires and connections and anything I could find to check as we rambled back towards Texas. We traveled from Cheyenne to Greeley, Colorado, then took the back roads down through Colorado into Oklahoma. Traveling was good, and then we found bumpy roads in Oklahoma. We really found the bumpy roads in that state. It was almost twilight when we were traveling through Boise City. We bounced across a set of railroad tracks that load. The bouncing was rough. I pulled over to the side of the road and informed Sheila that I had a feeling that I better check on things outside. I opened the door and stepped out and had to admire the beauty of the evening. There was hardly a sound. All I could hear was the engine running in the motorhome. All I could feel was the heat radiating off the road. I walked to the back of the motorhome just in time to see the front bumper of the pickup falling to the ground. The bounce had apparently sheared the bolts that connected the front bumper to the frame. The bumper was still hitched to the motorhome, but the pickup was not. At that instant, it was as free as a bird. I ran back to have Sheila come out and look because no one was going to believe this without seeing it. There sat the pickup, with the only thing connecting it in any fashion to the motorhome was the magnetically mounted tow lights that were on the roof and the pigtail cord that was still plugged into the outlet of the motorhome. That little box of plumbing parts, washers, bolts, and nuts had exactly what we needed. Plow bolts. There were 6 of them, with the correctly sized nuts and washers. Plow boats are heavy-duty and very strong. I could probably lift an entire pickup with a crane and 6 plow boats strategically placed. I replaced the 6-yeared bolts with heavy-duty plowboats that were just the right size, and we were heading to Dalhart. We were about 50 miles to go, and we had hopes to arrive and find an RV spot. We were in luck. We arrived, and there were still vacancies. We stayed at Western RV Park, and the best part, we were back in Texas. We enjoyed a good night's sleep and were refreshed enough in the morning to get an early start for home. The wind was blowing rather hard that morning. We unhooked from the campsite and headed out. We stopped at a local filling station to gas up. Part of the reason the motorhome was rather inexpensive to purchase was that it had a gasoline engine. It was old and a gas guzzler. When we pulled the pickup, we averaged about 8 miles per gallon. There was a sizable number of gas stations that enjoyed our business that summer. I planned to gas up while Sheila took the girls into the store to get treats. I had the nozzle in the tank filling while I was checking tires and doing my early morning walk around the vehicle routine. As luck would have it, a gust of wind somehow got a hold of one of my favorite contacts, and it went flying under the motorhome. What was I to do? Without my contacts, my vision is about 2400, and the contacts are a special type because of the severe astigmatism problem that I have called keratoconus. I wear hard contacts because they provide the shape of my eye needs to focus. Without them, my vision is only corrected to about 20/50 with glasses. When Sheila returned, I informed her of the problem. We decided to pull the motorhome straight forward and hope against hope that I could find the contact. Sheila didn't like driving it, but she pulled forward, seriously hoping that she would not run over it while I tried to search for it. I was hoping, too, that another gust of wind would not occur. Thankfully, the wind died down, and there it was, laying on the cement in one piece, waiting for me to pick it up. I was ecstatic. I washed it off and put it in my eye, and we continued down the road. Now, some may say that we were lucky. Some may say we were profoundly fortunate. Some may even think that this vacation story is fabricated. I will tell you what happened. I will tell you that it made me a firm believer in providence. If you are in God's graces, and it seems that we were, wonderful things happen. We made it home and talked about that trip for years. What happened to the motorhome, you may ask? We took a few additional trips, short trips within the state of Texas. Then a squirrel got into the walls, ate all of the wires to the refrigerator and the heater. I had a schematic for the wiring too. With little time and a good flashlight and some help from my children, I was able to successfully rewire it. I actually thought that I found the hole where the squirrel got in between the walls and sealed it. However, before we got the opportunity to take the motorhome out again, it happened again. This time, the squirrel found the wires under the hood, spark plug wires, electrical cable to the battery. Everything seemed to be a casualty of a feeding frenzy from squirrels. I gave up. I posted it on an online sales site and sold it for less than half of what I paid for it. It seems that relying on the providence of God is one thing. The possibility of tempting God is quite another.